What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my $30 budget counter fairy deck profile. Now you can make this entire deck with just 3 of the Wave of Light structure decks, which you can see all the contents of in my previous video. But a lot of you guys like these budget builds because, yeah, sure, while this may not win you a YCS or anything, if you have someone maybe who's looking to start getting into the game or something like that, you can just pick them up 3 structure decks and build them a template similar to this and bring it to locals and have a good time. Obviously, this isn't going to be the deck for everyone, but a lot of you guys, especially those budget players out there, like taking a look at these builds, so I thought I would go ahead and show that to you guys. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So starting off with 3 copies of Bountiful Artemis. Now basically, in Counter Fairies, Bountiful Artemis is your go-to card. This is your engine resource because every time you're resolving a counter trap card, you're getting to draw more resources. So Bountiful Artemis is absolutely critical when it comes to this deck, and you really should never run less than 3 Bountiful Artemis. Next up, we have 3 copies of Minerva Scholar of the Sky. This is one of the brand new cards in the structure deck, and frankly, this is another card that you want to max out on for a couple of reasons. First off, as long as you have counter trap cards with different names on the field and in the graveyard, as long as you have Sanctuary in the Sky on the field, you're going to be able to cycle those trap cards and add those resources back to your hand. So very similarly to Bountiful Artemis, you're going to be able to keep obtaining and re-obtaining resources, which is how this deck kind of, that's kind of the fault of this deck. When you run out of steam, you really don't have to do a lot to beat over this deck, so we want to have cards like Artemis and Minerva continually and gradually just keep attaining us resources. Secondly, every time a counter trap card resolves while you have Minerva on the field, it gains 500 attack. So basically, this is one of your big beaters without having to play a big beater. It basically will just get bigger and bigger the more counter trap cards you resolve. So it's not, uncommon to see this card get to 3,000 if not higher in attack value, and that could be something very difficult for some decks to deal with. So definitely recommend 3, especially for this budget build. Next, we have 3 copies of Guiding Ariadne. You definitely want 3 copies of Ariadne because not only does it make all of your counter traps essentially free while it's in the pendulum zone, but it's basically like your counter trap card searcher. If you didn't really get any counter traps, you can either crash it into your opponent's monster or just set it on the field and you're going to be able to get a counter trap card to your hand. So you definitely want to max out on this because there's so much versatility with this card all around. Now next up, we have 2 copies of Sacred Arc Air Knight Parshat. I only opted to go for 2 copies of this card because I feel that you don't want to have more than that. You're basically going to be summoning this off of the new counter trap card, which we'll get to in a little bit, and that's basically, you just need it in the deck because the trap card gets it out of the deck. You don't really want to draw this card because it can be a little bit bricky, but you want to have multiple copies because if you resolve the counter trap more than once, you want to be able to special summon this guy because this card is just absolutely phenomenal once it hits the board. So I feel like 2 is the perfect number in this instance. Next up, we have 2 copies of Power Angel Valkyria. I decided to only go with 2 because it's a very powerful card because when you're resolving these counter traps, this card recruits more advantage. It allows you to add light fairies to your hand, and that's really good because it basically can search the entire deck, but I feel like 3 is a little bit too excessive because 2 is like the right number. You can search it off of Ties of the Brethren. You basically aren't going to need to have more than this, and I feel like 2 is the correct number in this instance. Next, we have 1 Meltiel Sage of the Sky. This is a card where it's very powerful because if you have Sanctuary in the Sky on the field, which is the direction we took this deck, you're able to pop cards on the field when you resolve counter traps, and the body is decent as well. So basically, this is something you can just search off of Ties of the Brethren or just search with Power Angel Valkyria, and you're going to be in really good shape. Basically, it's a card though that's bad when you're coming from behind because if you don't have counter traps established, Meltiel doesn't really do anything. This is a card where if you have a board established, you want to have Meltiel there to pretty much just grant you additional value out of each of your counter traps. Last but not least, we run 2 copies of Honest. Now, the reason I went with Honest is because this deck lacks proactive forms of hard removal, and what I mean by that is there's no like Regeki or Dark Hole or anything in this deck, and I feel like Honest is good because you can summon any of your monsters and then proactively swing into your opponent's monsters and use Honest to get rid of them. So you can proactively deal with threats, but then you can also react to your opponent's plays as well if they attack into your monsters by dropping Honest. Worst case scenario, since Ties of the Brethren is in this deck, you can basically drop Honest, Ties of the Brethren to get 2 of your monsters out, and then bounce Honest back to your hand with its effect, so that way you're not losing the Honest. So that's a pretty cool interaction as well. I definitely feel that Honest is warranted in this deck because of the absence of hard removal. So that's it for the monsters. It's going to be more monsters than a typical counter fairy deck, but obviously this is the budget version, so we have to make some concessions there. Moving on to the spells, 3 copies of Ties of the Brethren. You want to max out on this card because this is like your power card. I know Ash Blossom exists, so that's, you know, it's a bit unfortunate, but if this card resolves, you are going to be in phenomenal shape because you are going to have a board of Power Angel Valkyria, Bountiful Artemis, and then either Minerva, maybe Meltiel. You can basically just get anything out of your deck outside of the Arc Air Knight Parshat itself. So this card is phenomenal. This is your ideal turn 1 opening card. If they Ash it, you know, oh well, it's just one less card you have to worry about, but if they don't, you are going to be in a phenomenal position, especially if you're backed by counter traps. Next up, we have 3 copies of the Sanctum of Parshat. So I did decide to go with the Sanctuary in the Sky route, which this card is treated as, because this deck really needs just a really solid power play all around, and Sanctuary in the Sky enables so many just hidden abilities that cards have that I feel it's definitely warranted in a budget build like this. It gives you protection for your counter traps as well, which is very valuable. Boosts all your monsters by 300. It really does a lot for the deck, and I think it's very, very ideal. Then in tandem with that, we're actually running 2 copies of the normal Sanctuary in the Sky as well. Now, this is something you can tweak with. I felt like 5 copies of Sanctuary in the Sky is enough because the reason is we're running cards like Divine Punishment, which require you to have Sanctuary in the Sky on the field. So basically, this is very good because you want to always see Sanctuary in the Sky, at least in 1 copy, because otherwise, cards like Divine Punishment aren't going to do anything. Meltiel's not going to get its pop effect. Minerva's not going to get its recursion effect. So you really just want to make sure you have at least 1 copy of Sanctuary in the Sky at some point. Worst case scenario, you can always just pitch these for cards like Ultimate Providence or the counter trap that summons the Air Knight Parshat. There's a lot of ways that you can just use it as extra fodder if you don't need it or if you draw it in multiples, but I felt like 5 copies was the correct number. So that's it for the spell cards, and then moving on to the bulk of the deck, the counter trap. So starting off with 3 copies of Rebirth of Parshat, this card is just absolutely phenomenal. Now the biggest drawback I would say is you have to have a counter trap in hand, so it's a little bit counterintuitive because you want to set all your counter traps, but you have to keep one in hand for this card to actually work. But the payoff's really big because it's basically like a Solemn Judgment. You have to discard a card, so like I said, you can just discard something like Sanctuary in the Sky if you really want to, and ultimately it just gets your big boss monster onto the field. So I feel that's completely invaluable in a deck like this. Next up, we have 3 copies of Divine Punishment. This is basically Solemn Judgment as long as you control Sanctuary in the Sky, and that's why my Sanctuary in the Sky count is rather high, because I want to make sure that this card is live as often as possible, because a lot of the times if your opponent just leaves Sanctuary in the Sky on the field, you can punish them with Divine Punishment. Now moving on, we have 3 copies of Drastic Drop-Off as well. I feel like this is like your automatic go-to counter trap if you have it, because in instance of cards like Minerva, where you want to start cycling the counter traps in your graveyard, you can just have a card like Drastic Drop-Off, which disrupts your opponent, but that's kind of the card you can use to add back one of the more powerful counter trap cards like Divine Punishment or anything like that back to your hand. So I feel like it's really good for disruption and ultimately just a solid card all around. Next up, we have 3 copies of Ultimate Providence. Ultimate Providence, again, is Solemn Judgment, except you have to discard a card of the same type. So if your opponent activates a spell card, you have to discard a spell card. But again, we have additional copies of Sanctuary in the Sky for that, so it's not really the end of the world if we draw multiples, because Ultimate Providence provides some fodder and some utility for those extra copies of Sanctuary in the Sky. Great card all around. I mean, basically, as long as you just have something in your hand that you need to negate, that Ultimate Providence is going to help take care of that for you. Now, rounding out the counter traps, we have 2 copies of Recall and 1 copy of Dark Bribe. The counter traps in this deck are a little bit lacking because we didn't get stuff like Solemn Strike reprinted in here compared to like the OCG, so I used Recall because Recall is basically Solemn Strike, except it gives your opponent a card. Dark Bribe is the same thing, except it negates spell and trap cards. But the interesting thing about these cards is not only do they negate effects, but you have to realize you're going to be gaining value as long as you have any of your monsters on the board. So yes, your opponent may draw a card, but at the same time, you're going to be drawing cards off Artemis. You're going to be recurring cards with Minerva. Power Angel Valkyria is going to be adding cards to your hand. So in the instance of if you're actually established, having them draw a card isn't the end of the world, but this deck just needs more counter traps because this is counter fairies. So you can tweak with this ratio, but I feel like the 2-to-1 is good. I mean, you get 3 copies of each across all 3 decks, so tweak with the ratio however you wish. And last but not least, we wrap it up with 1 copy of Solemn Warning. Solemn Warning is only at 1, but I mean, it's basically the best counter trap, maybe the best counter trap in here as a whole, just because it stops summons. But overall, you're definitely going to want to include your 1 copy of that. So guys, that's it for my budget counter fairy deck profile. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this deck, and if this is something that you think you would modify, or maybe have a different take on the whole deck altogether. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.